Picture, for a moment, a landscape that was once a crystalline lake. Today, what remains of Lake Urmia in Iran are only endless expanses of white salt and cracked earth, like open scars on the surface of the planet. In the streets of Tehran, the capital, entire buildings develop mysterious cracks and the ground literally sinks beneath the feet of its 9 million inhabitants. When we think about collapsing countries, our minds immediately go to devastating wars, suffocating economic sanctions, or political revolutions. But in Iran, the most dangerous enemy doesn't come from beyond its borders, doesn't wear military uniforms, and doesn't make inflammatory speeches on television. It lies underground. Water, the primordial source of all life, is silently disappearing, taking with it not just crops and cities, but the very stability of a millennial nation. And as history has taught us time and again, when water dries up, entire empires crumble. The question isn't whether this will happen, it's when. For over 2,000 years, Persia flourished where other empires died of thirst. The secret wasn't an abundance of water, after all, much of Iranian territory has always been desert, but in human ingenuity working with scarcity. The ancient Persians developed an ingenious system called Qanat, an underground network of channels that captured water from mountains and conducted it dozens of kilometers to desert villages and cities. These underground tunnels, some over 1,000 years old, weren't just engineering works, they were social contracts. Entire communities organized around their maintenance and sharing. Each family knew exactly when they could use water, for how long, and for what purpose. It was a system that worked because everyone understood a fundamental truth: in the desert, water is life, and wasting it means collective death. For centuries, this ancestral wisdom kept the cities of the Silk Road prosperous, irrigated legendary Persian gardens, and sustained one of the world's most sophisticated civilizations. But the transition to the modern era brought a new logic: giant dams as symbols of progress, industrial monocultures as promises of prosperity, and the seductive illusion that modern technology could tame the desert once and for all. That promise is now extracting a price that may be unpayable. Between the 1960s and 2000s, Iran embarked on a frantic race to modernize. Oil gushed money into government coffers, and the watchword was development at any cost. Dozens of gigantic dams began sprouting across the country like mushrooms after rain, each promising to be the definitive solution to problems of water, energy, and agriculture. The plans seemed perfect on paper: dam rivers, create artificial reservoirs, irrigate vast cotton and wheat plantations, supply growing cities, and generate clean energy. It was the promise of transforming a semi-arid country into a modern oasis. Politicians cut ribbons with radiant smiles, foreign engineers received million-dollar contracts, and state media celebrated each new dam as a victory of human ingenuity over nature. But nature, as always, collected its due. Rivers that had flowed freely for millennia were strangled. Underground aquifers, formed over tens of thousands of years, were sucked dry in just a few decades. Entire ecosystems simply vanished. Lake Urmia, once the world's sixth largest salt lake, lost 80% of its surface area. Where there was once aquatic life and migratory birds, today there's only a salt desert visible from space. But water scarcity wouldn't remain confined to the countryside. It was about to invade the very foundations of cities. Tehran is literally sinking. And it's not a metaphor, it's pure physics. When underground aquifers are excessively pumped, the soil above them loses support and collapses. The technical term is subsidence, but for the 9 million inhabitants of the Iranian capital, it's simply a death sentence in slow motion. Some Tehran neighborhoods sink up to 22 centimeters per year. To grasp the scale, this means that in a decade, the ground can drop more than 2 meters. Buildings develop cracks that spread like spider webs, roads undulate like roller coasters, and even the city's international airport already shows signs of structural deformation. The most frightening aspect is that this process is irreversible. When an aquifer collapses, it never returns to normal, even if pumping stops. It's like squeezing a dry sponge until it disintegrates, there's no undoing the damage. Millions of people literally live atop a geological time bomb, where the ground could give way at any moment. And it's not just Tehran. Other Iranian cities like Isfahan, Shiraz, and Mashhad face the same fate. It's not just water that's disappearing, it's the ground that literally vanishes beneath millions of people's feet. When cities enter physical collapse, the crisis quickly stops being merely environmental and becomes a matter of political survival. To understand the true dimension of this crisis, we need to look beyond numbers and charts. We need to look at people like Ahmad, a pistachio farmer from Kerman province who, after 5 generations working the same land, was forced to abandon everything. His well, which for decades gushed crystal-clear water, dried completely in 2019. Today, Ahmad works as a taxi driver in Tehran's chaotic streets, another internal climate refugee in his own country. Ahmad's story is repeated by the thousands throughout Iran. Entire villages have been abandoned when wells dried up. Farms that produced saffron, dates, and roses, products that made Persia famous worldwide, are now just stretches of arid land. Livestock breeders sell their herds for ridiculous prices before they die of thirst. This forced migration is creating a social bomb in cities. Tehran, already overpopulated, saw its population grow 40% in 2 decades, largely composed of desperate rural families. Improvised slums sprout in the peripheries, where water arrives by tank trucks at prohibitive prices. Conflicts between remaining rural communities and local authorities become increasingly frequent, with protests that often end in confrontation with police. What began as a natural resource crisis is rapidly transforming into an explosive issue of social justice. And it's here that the water problem meets the country's political instability. Behind Iran's water crisis lies a complex network of political and economic interests that many analysts call the water mafia. These aren't criminal organizations in the traditional sense, but rather local elites, corrupt bureaucrats, and businessmen connected to power who profit directly from water chaos. Large water infrastructure projects have become sources of enrichment for the few, while the population suffers from scarcity. $1 million contracts for dam construction are distributed among companies linked to the Revolutionary Guards, the country's elite military force. Inefficient irrigation systems are maintained because they benefit influential farmers who plant water-intensive crops like rice in the middle of the desert. The lack of coordination between Iran's 31 provinces further aggravates the problem. Each region acts as if it were an independent country, building its own dams and diverting water from neighbors without any joint planning. Isfahan blames Yazd, which blames Kerman, which blames the central government in Tehran. Meanwhile, water continues disappearing. The central government, in turn, resists structural reforms that could affect these established interests. Any real change in the water management system would mean confronting powerful political allies, something the regime avoids at all costs, especially at a time of international pressure and internal instability. But Iran doesn't face this crisis alone. There's a much larger geopolitical chessboard at play, the silent war for water in the Middle East. In the Middle East, water is becoming more valuable than oil, and potentially more explosive. Iran critically depends on rivers that originate in other countries, a strategic vulnerability that its neighbors know very well how to exploit. Take Turkey's example, which built dozens of dams on the Tigris and Euphrates rivers as part of its ambitious Southeast Anatolia project. Each new Turkish dam means less water flowing to Iran and Iraq. What Ankara calls national development, Tehran sees as a hydrological weapon pointed at its economic heart. The situation is even tenser on the Afghanistan border. The Helmand River, which originates in Afghan mountains, is the only significant freshwater source for Iran's Sistan-Baluchistan province. For decades, disputes over this water's use have generated diplomatic crises and even armed confrontations at the border. In 2017, Iranian and Afghan soldiers exchanged fire in a dispute directly related to water resource control. Each country in the region is waging its own water war, often at neighbors' expense. Israel developed desalination technologies to become independent. Saudi Arabia pumps fossil aquifers to maintain its desert agriculture. Egypt threatens military action if Ethiopia reduces the Nile's flow. And Iran, trapped between neighbors who control its water sources, finds itself increasingly desperate. In the modern Middle East, water is becoming as strategic as oil, and as explosive as gunpowder. What begins as an ecological crisis can quickly transform into the trigger for a regional conflict that nobody wants, but everyone is preparing to face. Looking toward the future, 3 scenarios emerge for Iran, each more dramatic than the last. In the first scenario, continuity, the country maintains its current policies until the inevitable day zero. Tehran faces severe water rationing, agriculture collapses, and waves of national protests shake the regime. Entire cities might be evacuated when the ground gives way completely, creating millions of internal refugees. In the second scenario, partial collapse, the government implements draconian emergency measures, militarization of water distribution, forced population relocation, and violent repression of protests. The country transforms into a hydrological police state, where water access determines who lives where and how. A third scenario exists, radical reform, but it would require changes that seem politically impossible, real cooperation with neighbors, dismantling the water mafia, massive investment in desalination and renewable energy, and a complete revolution in agricultural practices. It would require acknowledging decades of mistakes and confronting consolidated interests. Each of these scenarios demands painful choices. But time to choose is running out as quickly as water in Iranian aquifers. The question is no longer whether there will be a crisis, it's how catastrophic it will be. Iran's water crisis isn't an isolated case, it's a prelude to what's coming for much of the world. Cape Town, South Africa, nearly reached day zero in 2018. Chennai, India, with 10 million inhabitants, completely ran out of water in 2019. California faces record droughts, and cities like Las Vegas pump water from aquifers that will take centuries to replenish. What makes the Iranian case particularly frightening is how an environmental crisis can rapidly transform into political instability, regional conflict, and social collapse. It's a real-time laboratory of how complex societies respond when a fundamental resource disappears. Human history is replete with examples of civilizations that vanished when water ran out. The Maya, the Khmer Empire, various Silk Road cities, all learned the hard way that even the most sophisticated societies are vulnerable to water scarcity. The difference is that today we live in an interconnected world, where one country's collapse can destabilize entire regions. Iran shows us that water isn't just an environmental issue, it's a matter of national security, regional stability, and civilizational survival. History teaches us that when water disappears, empires fall. What's happening in Iran today is a silent warning to the entire world. The question isn't whether there will be water conflicts in our future, the question is where they'll begin, and whether we'll be prepared when they reach our doorstep.